That is the challenge and the gift of the spiritual space of wilderness. It is the place where we learn how to trust God. Not just any God, not a God that only exists in our own philosophies or our own minds, but a God who we actually have to encounter. What does it look like to trust in God? Well, in the book of Exodus, chapter 20, verses 1 through 17, we receive the story of the Israelites getting the 10 Commandments. Okay, the 10 Commandments that sort of give the guidelines, the boundaries that are going to help contain this relationship between the people Israel and their God. And so you can always visit Exodus 20, 1 through 17 to see what those commandments are, what these promises are. But later on, Jesus helps condense them. Jesus actually puts them all together. Those 10 commandments and the more than 600 other rules that are part of the Jewish Torah, the Jewish teaching, he takes them all together and he says, when asked, the greatest, most important commandment is to love your God with all you are. And a second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. Those are the guidelines. Those are the ways that we learn to trust. We trust that God has everything under control, and there's no excuse for us to not be loving, to learn how to love the one who made us, to learn how to love ourselves, and learn how to love our neighbor better than we do, better than we have. Well, then along comes Jesus, and we see how Jesus kind of starts to unsettle the powers that be. In this particular story, in the Gospel according to John, chapter 2, verses 13 through 22. It's a story that goes like this. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then said to him, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. Jesus doesn't get upset and throw a big fit because he's anti-economy. He does it because they formed an economy, the religious powers that be formed a whole way of making money that made it seem as though they were in control rather than God, rather than trusting that God was in control. They had set up an elaborate system where they said if you are able to afford a cow or a dove or some other animal to offer as a sacrifice here, or if you're able to exchange money for these other forms of service, then we can guarantee, we can help you trust that God forgives you for everything you've done. And when Jesus hears this, he doesn't hear this as them breaking the rules. They're actually following the rules explicitly. He sees this as an infringement upon their relationship with God. He's saying you don't get to show up and pretend like you have everything under control, that you have the power to make God do stuff. If you're pretending to do that, that's not okay. And so he throws tables over and makes a whip and whips the cows out of the sanctuary. Friends, unless we take time to go to the wilderness every once in a while, unless we take time to leave behind the rules, the regulations, the civilization from which we come, we don't know how to reconnect with God. We only know what other people tell us about God. If we don't take time every once in a while to go out into the wilderness, we don't even know what's wrong with our lives. What are the hard things that are happening and why? We don't have enough distance to reflect on those. So we have this gift, this spiritual space of wilderness, which I'm not even going to go into any more description of, because you all know what it's like to be out in the woods. You know what it's like to lose control. You have to start going to sleep when the sun goes down, because you don't have any lights. You have to eat when food is ready, rather than whenever you want. You have to get your water from a particular source and think about where that water came from and how to boil it and prepare it and what needs to happen next. You live differently in the wilderness. And that is the space where we are invited to do some growing and stretching and communing with God. So we know what that looks like, and we may even know what it feels like. Let me very quickly, before I turn it over to Dan, let me quickly just share with you this illustration for why it's important. How many of you are familiar with how lobsters lose their shells? A few of us are. Okay, Matt, what can you tell me about a lobster losing its shell?
As it grows, it molts.
Yeah.
So the shell comes off and a new shell is underneath and it gets larger.
That's right. That is exactly what happens. Lobsters never stop growing, but they do outgrow their shells. And so as they get too big for their shells, they have to shed, they have to molt, they shed the shell, and then they move on with their lives.
And I eat them.
And they eat the shell?
No, I eat.
Oh, you and then you. Oh, hold on, because that's an important piece. Mary, do you have anything to add to that? Okay, so here's what I learned this week about how lobsters shed, about the process of this. So when they grow lobsters are constantly evolving. Their shell is always developing, their new one underneath the old one. And as soon as they've grown too big for their old shell, here's what they do. They take in a bunch of water. They just keep drinking water. They take it in and take it in and take it in until their flesh grows so wide and large that it actually unsticks their shell. It actually separates from them. And after that, because their exoskeleton, their bones are on the outside, they take their fleshy bits and they squeeze out of the shell and they leave it all behind. And when they do this, they are leaving behind their natural protection. They're leaving behind their ability to move. Once they're out of their shell, lobsters can only stand on the ocean floor for about 30 minutes at a time before just having to float there. But get this, they also leave behind their claws, so now they're defenseless. And they also leave behind their eyeballs. So they're blind during this entire time. So until the new skeleton hardens and they develop new claws and new eyes, they are spending this time floating around, completely exposed, at the whim of everything else around them. That's where we find ourselves in the wilderness. It's when we are so lost we can't even see where we are. It's when we are so unable to control our lives and our circumstances around us that we're just floating down the current. It's when we're unable to support ourselves, and so we're in need of learning how to trust that maybe a power beyond us is really protecting us. This is the only space where we can learn how to live in new ways. That's what makes it so important. And we're honored to have Dan here this morning. Dan, you're welcome to share from down there or up here, whatever makes you most comfortable. And we would love to hear what you have to share with us about wilderness.
Thinking of growing and stretching, going up there is a little beyond my stretch right now. I do want to say this is the nicest tent I've ever been in the wilderness. This is quite large. So, Brian asked me to share a little bit, and we had a great chat this week about this topic. And somewhere along the line, someone told me to listen to birds. And that's what keeps coming up for me as I was thinking about today. When I think about wilderness, to me it's about listening. It's about quieting down my own stories, my own pace of the busy world around me. And for me, the trigger for that is to listen to birds, or to watch birds. Even if I can't hear what they're doing, just watch them. So that to me has been really helpful. What it forces me to do is to ask some questions. And so I've been really lucky, and I think many people in this building are very lucky as well, that to have had an interrupter in my life. Someone to say, ask hard questions. Someone to make me think twice about things. So even just one of the first things I heard when I walked in here today and maybe it's a normal part of your practice, and I don't know this, but it's that, we are here to worship an unsettling God. That is something I've never heard, and it's perfect, and it's disruptive. It disrupts a process. It forces us to sit in that place of tension, where there's faith, belief, and figure out where we are. So I didn't get into listening to birds because I wanted to understand a spiritual journey. I did it because I wanted to touch a deer. I read a story about some kids, some Apache kids out west, who when they were really young, as a rite of passage, they were able to run down and touch deer. And I thought, I want to do that. I was an athlete, I was very physical, I was very competitive, and I had a lot of energy. I was kind of a spastic kid, and I had to do something with that energy. And a mentor came into my life, a teacher at my school, and told me this story. And just walked away. He knew I was taking this bait. And slowly but surely, I started to try and get close to these animals in the wilderness. This is the wilderness of the Jersey Shore, by the way. So, the wilderness doesn't have to be the 100-mile wilderness in Katahdin and Baxter. It can be at your bird feeder in your yard. It can be as you're about to walk out your door before you go to your car. Wilderness is everywhere. This is a very busy area. And long story short, it took me a very long time, and I couldn't get close to deer because I didn't understand that the birds were always giving me away. And that the birds and the deer are listening to each other, and the birds and the fox and the deer are listening to each other, and the squirrels and the fox and the deer, and you name it. And that's when it made me realize, why am I not listening to everything around me? Why am my fellow humans, most of us, at least in my experience, often don't listen to the other critters we share this world with. And so that really made me ask the question, what's happening here? What is this telling me? So that's a question I like to carry with me, to carry that little bit of tension. And it's fortuitous that I was asked to do this now because it's actually, I'm at another point in my life where I'm doing that again. So I'm starting to ask, I've had, I had a point where it's actually sitting in the wilderness. I defended my master's thesis, drove to the New Jersey Pine Barrens. We created our own amazing, funky ceremony. It was my bachelor party. It was like 6 men ceremony and fire and water, and we made something out of it. It was beautiful. And then I sat in the river and just was like reflecting and feeling all sorts of emotion and fear and pain and sorrow and joy. And the next morning I was going to get married. And I do things fast, sometimes too fast. And at that point in time, I decided to change paths and start this thing called Waypoint programs, which I'm not going to go a lot into today, but creating space for people to make space to bring wilderness into their life. 20 years later, or more now, I'm starting to ask again, what do I want to do with my life? Is this what I'm best served? Is this what I'm best served to do? Is this really my calling? Is this, what does this look like? And just challenging those assumptions, giving myself the freedom to sit with that unsettling question. Because normally I don't want to. I just want to keep going, get things done, check things off, be accomplished, be successful. But the wilderness space of reflection forces me to ask those hard questions. What could it look like otherwise? That's unsettling. And I think many of us see people's lives get turned upside down, inside out, and there's that old story, good, bad, who knows? It's hard to say. It feels hard. It feels the struggle is real. The pain is real. But for me, being able to use nature as a trigger, the song of a bird, the flutter of a leaf in the wind, those are the things that let us have, I think, reflection right in the moment. And they can be small moments. And then I think it's important to take some time, and I don't do this as much as I would like to. I struggle with it too. To take longer chunks of time, to go further away, to create that distance and space. Instead of 5 minutes, now it's a couple of days or 5 hours. Maybe it's seasonal, maybe it's, around certain festivals or holidays or seasonal changes where we just ask those questions. What's happening here? Is this what I want my life to be like? What am I heading toward? Who do I want to become? What am I doing to become that person? What do I want to step away from? So, that's what I have to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. gift. Friends, humans are a lot like lobsters. The only problem is our shells don't come attached to us. We are constantly growing and evolving, but our shells that we outgrow are invisible. They're intangible. Maybe they're emotional, maybe they're intellectual, maybe they are spiritual. We have to find ways of being comfortable with being uncomfortable, of finding a way of exploring the unsettled wilderness. In our tradition, we trust that there's a God who ultimately we can trust. And if you ever have a hard time knowing how to explore this wilderness space, where to turn when everything seems topsy-turvy, Dan shared with me earlier this week, part of tracking in the wilderness is following the energy. Friends, lobsters don't just randomly shed their shell. They do it when they've taken in enough water. Water is our symbol of life. They do it when they've taken in enough life that they have expanded beyond their container. So whenever you feel stuck, whenever you feel lost, whenever you feel like there is no way through the wilderness, follow the energy. What's giving you life? And what do you need to let go of in order to follow it? That's the way of life. That's the path. And in a second, we will share a celebration of that path here at the table. And before we do that, I invite you to sing with us our communion hymn, number 313, Like a Tree Beside the Water.